On the morning of the 21st of June 1961, American author Ernest Hemingway had awoken in his house in Ketchum, walked downstairs, picked out his favourite shotgun from an unlocked gun case, and ended his life at the age of 61. At the time, the news of Hemingway's death had been declared by his wife as having been an accident, yet the truth was soon admitted, and it left a lot of people confused as to why someone who had universally been seen as a successful, larger-than-life personality had chosen to end it all himself. And the question is still being asked today. However, now the variables related to his mental decline occurring early and late within Hemingway's life typically seem to be agreed on. These variables include his heavy drinking, multiple concussions, severe depression, bipolar disorder, and a genetic condition of iron metabolism known as hemochromatosis, which both fatigued Hemingway and ruined his ability to remember anything. Knowing what we know now about mental conditions and mental health, these variables are all theorised and debated over, as fans and professionals alike try to figure out what particular one had caused the greatest impact on Hemingway's decision to die. Yet during the time, the shock of the news of a suicide had only left the majority of the people of 1961 at a loss. However, there was one man who had had a different question in mind from the general population when news of Hemingway's suicide had made it to the press and onto the pages of that morning's papers. That man was a 23-year-old aspiring writer called Ernest Thompson, who is best now known for writing the classic gonzo journalist book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Working as a freelance journalist, Thompson had spent the early 60s writing for various news organisations whenever he could, and it was with a great satisfaction when he was assigned to write a 2,000-word article about the death of Ernest Hemingway by the National Observer in 1964, as Thompson was finally given the opportunity to answer the question that had niggled at him for those past 3 years. And it was this question to which Thompson gave the article its title, What Lured Hemingway to Ketchum? The article was published in the National Observer on the 25th of May 1964, and it is essentially a toned-down Thompson trying to discover why Hemingway, in the final years of his life, had moved from the locations to which he was famous for residing in, such as Cuba, Africa or Paris, in exchange for a small city like Ketchum. It begins with a neighbour of Hemingway's describing a day in which he had caught Hemingway wandering along near a main road, looking frail and thin. When explaining the, in his own words, embarrassing state in which he had observed Hemingway, he caveats his lack of intervention in the scene as being due to the man in question being Hemingway himself, and explains if it had been anyone else, he would have gone out and told them to be careful. The following lines describe Hemingway's chalet and the scenery surrounding it. Thompson mentions the view of the Sawtooth Mountains in the distance, coupled with the big wood river to which the house overlooks, yet not before mentioning the big elk horns placed over the front door to the chalet. From here, Thompson presents his interest in discovering just what about Ketchum enticed Hemingway to live out his final years there. He quotes Hemingway in a story from Green Hills of Africa when he writes, "Something happens to our good writers at a certain age. You see, we make our writers into something very strange. We destroy them in many ways." Thompson then argues that although Hemingway was aware of a writer's ability to be destroyed, he was not aware of how he himself was being destroyed. Ketchum, to Thompson, was for Hemingway a place that had not yet been changed since Hemingway visited here in the times before World War II. Thus, for Hemingway, Ketchum became somewhat of a slice of the past to which he could relive his younger years. However, this inability, Thompson argues, to adapt to the modern had negatively impacted his relevancy as a writer. Following this, Thompson recounts the people he spoke to whilst in Ketchum. He spoke to Chuck Atkinson, owner of a Ketchum motel, who told Thompson of Hemingway's appreciation of the locals for leaving him alone, as well as people like Charlie Mason, a wandering pianist who championed Hemingway's ability to drink relentlessly, all the while telling anecdotes of his time spent in bars with Hemingway. One of the anecdotes included a time when Hemingway answered a question from Mason on breaking into the literary life. Hemingway responded to Mason by stressing the importance of conviction and knowing what to leave out, to which Thompson then suggests that there was evidence to refute Hemingway's claims on knowing when to leave something out, and that his conviction had not survived the Second World War. Thompson uses examples of F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, and Dos Passos as writers who, no matter how good, all lost their conviction when the world no longer accepted it. But this does not mean that Thompson argues that this conviction has been passed down to the next generation. He instead concedes that in his present day, the 60s, the world was moving too fast for any writers to keep up. It is not just a writer's crisis, but they are the most obvious victims because the function of art is supposedly to bring order out of chaos. A tall order even when the chaos is static, and a superhuman task in a time when chaos is multiplying. Thompson concludes that Hemingway was an apolitical man who did not care for movements, and instead focused in his writing on the humanity of the individuals caught up in the hardships of the world. He dealt in complex yet binary issues, and could not adapt to the multiple sides of the new world issues developing in the modern age. Thus, Hemingway retreated to the only place untouched by this new age, Ketchum, Idaho, a place where he felt his footing fell on solid ground, and chose to reclaim any of the good old days as he could with his old friends, drinking and shooting whenever he pleased, whilst steering clear of the way things were now by completing his final book, dedicated to the lost generation of Paris in the 20s. As we know, Thompson's career exploded to great heights within the following years of this article being published, with books such as the aforementioned Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, as well as Hell's Angels, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, and a collection of Thompson's articles titled The Great Shark Hunt. Thompson had ascended to the status of a highly respected writer with a public persona not too far off Hemingway's own. Which would not displease Thompson to be admitted, as he himself was a fan of Hemingway. In his early years he copied out A Farewell to Arms word for word in an attempt to capture Hemingway's prose, and had cited him as the man who taught him that he could be a writer. And so, of course, when Thompson was assigned this article, he couldn't help but take a souvenir on his way out of Ketchum. And that souvenir happened to be the antlers hanging over the front of Hemingway's house. But of course, Thompson didn't mention this part in the article. The antlers were thus placed in Thompson's study over the years following his wild life. He dubbed the act of taking them as becoming somewhat of a literary responsibility on him due to their significance, yet had also in conversations with his wife expressed regret and embarrassment at the action, and even had entertained the idea of returning the antlers at some point. Yet time went on and Thompson's life accelerated into fame, money and notoriety, and before he knew it, his life had ended in 2005 at the age of 67, when Thompson shot himself in his study located in Owl Farm. The parallels that had occurred were not lost on the public, as Thompson, in the same way as Hemingway, had eventually been overtaken by the coming of a new age, and with it, a new media. That is not to suggest that he was forgotten, but the world he so accurately ordered out of chaos in the late 60s and early 70s had long gone, and, coupled with a list of physical and mental problems occurring over his life, Thompson saw no way out, and for what must have seemed the best of reasons, ended it with a handgun. It would be 11 years later when one day Thompson's wife, Anita Thompson, would drive back to Ketchum and return the antlers to Hemingway's family herself. The Hemingway family were incredibly accommodating of the gesture, and eventually handed them over to Sean Hemingway, Hemingway's grandson, who has the antlers still with him today, hopefully not hanging over the front door.